So, you want to be 7 levels up on everyone else and think that makes you good at the game? Well then, being a solo laner is for you. Yep, it's that time of the year again where I bring out the new, updated, in-depth guides for every role in Conquest. Being my primary role that I know the most about, solo lane is up first, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. As always, I'll be dividing this guide into a few different sections to make it easier to take in, since there's a lot of information from complete beginner stuff to very advanced techniques to push your game to the next level in solo. I want all levels of players to be able to watch and pick up useful information from these guides, and yes, that includes people who know absolutely nothing about solo. Hopefully I can change that by the end of this video. These role guides take by far the longest of all videos I make, and a ton of work goes into researching, scripting, writing, and editing these guides to make them as good as they possibly can be for you guys. So if you appreciate the effort and learn something from this guide, then definitely drop a subscribe for more in the future and leave a like on the video. But let's get into this. The first section will be covering that beginner kind of information, the basic premise of what solo lane is, where it is, and what your role is in a typical Conquest team as a solo laner. If you already know Conquest to a basic level, I recommend skipping this section using the timestamps on screen or in the pinned comment down below. Following that, I'll discuss viable god picks for solo, what types of playstyles and picks fit the role best, and what you'll have the most success with. After that, I'll cover item choices, builds, relics, etc., why I build the way I do, as well as some example builds for warrior and guardian solo laners. After that, we'll talk about the dynamics of the laning phase in solo. This section is extremely important as solo lane is a very optimized role with tons of things you can do to get better at laning. The laning phase of solo is arguably the most important but most misunderstood area of being a solo laner, and hopefully I can clear that up in this section. And finally, we'll close out the guide with how to teamfight and play with your team effectively on a solo lane god, as well as a bit on objective play and sieging. Okay, so with the contents laid out, you can skip around as you see fit to learn what you need to learn. The last two sections especially are ones I definitely wouldn't recommend missing, and especially the build section as well if you're not confident in your builds. So the first thing to know when you want to play solo lane would be, where is the damn thing? Well, solo lane is located on the fire giant side of the map for both teams and can also be identified by the distance between the two towers being shorter than the other side lane or it being near the blue buff. Solo laners in Conquest usually fill the role of a frontline tank for the team. You'll be farming up and fighting your lane opponent throughout the early and mid game, then rotating with your hopefully significant lead over other roles and filling that tanky frontline role for the team. If you like warriors or tanks in general and being that frontliner type of playstyle, you'll probably be right at home in solo lane. So as I just mentioned, solo lane is mostly reserved for tanky gods or gods that can build tanky. This means any warrior is fine for solo lane. Some will be better than others depending on the meta, but any of them is fine. Guardians are probably the second most represented class in solo, with Ares, Athena, Cabrakan, Cerberus, Jormungandr, Kuzenbo, Sobek, Jingchen, Yamoja, and Ymir being the most popular Guardians for solo. Not all of these are viable all the time, but in the past these Guardians have seen the most success in solo. Assassins see some limited play in solo as well. Keep in mind that if you're playing an assassin in solo, you'll want to build a list a little bit tanky or bruisery to keep pace with the warriors and guardians. The most represented assassins for solo are Camazotz, Fenrir, Nejar, Set, Thanatos, and Thor, though others can work in specific metas or against specific picks. As for mages, they don't see too much play, but a few can work. Once again, you'll typically build bruiser or tanky on these mages if you want to play them in solo lane. Aphrodite, Baron Samedi, Chang'e, Hades, Hel, and Zhonghui are the most represented mages for solo. Most are sustain focused as healing is very important in solo. As for hunters, I would just stay away from them in general. No hunters see consistent high level play in solo lane. You can try and make some of them work, but in general they're not worth trying if you want to win and learn the role effectively. So due to the nature of solo lane being very diverse with up to 4 different classes of gods seeing play, I can't cover build options for every class, so I'm going to focus on warriors and guardians. Keep in mind though that some of the information from warriors will transfer to tanky assassins, and some of the information from guardians will transfer to tanky mages. But if you need builds for those classes, I recommend looking them up outside this video, simply because the video will be too long if I covered every build option. But let's jump in with the warrior items. So warriors are going to be what you see in solo 90% of the time, so it's important to know correct builds for them, not just for yourself, but also so you can know what items enemy warriors will be building and how to deal with them. In this section, I'll cover starting builds as well as all my item options and why I think they're good, then conclude with example builds for every warrior in the game if you're just looking for a solid build to get started. So starting builds for warriors, this starter build focuses on heavy sustain in the early game of solo, and I recommend it if you're new to the role or just like a reliable low risk start. For this one, get Warrior's Blessing, Chalice of Healing, and 4 multi-potions. With this start, you don't get an item early on which slows down your build a little, but you have tons of sustain in this build to get you through the early laning phase and can stack the effects of Chalice and multi-potions to get 15 health per second in regen. Really good for the sustained fights you often see in solo. My second start involves starting a tier 1 item for your early build. You'll still get Warrior's Blessing, but instead of Chalice, you'll get Round Shield or Tier 1 boots. Right now, I don't really recommend the boot start, but it has been good in the past, so I'm including it here for longevity. And the Round Shield start is only for gods that rush into Berserker's Shield or Gladiator's Shield early on. Right now, those gods are Bellona, Erlang Shen, and Amaterasu for Berserker's Shield, and Osiris, Cuchulainn, King Arthur, Achilles, Mulan, and Sun Wukong for Gladiator's Shield. If your warrior is not any of these 9, then go for another start like the sustain start that I mentioned earlier. Then just spend any remaining gold you have after buying your blessing and tier 1 item on potions. For the shield start, get 3 health potions, and for the boot start, you can get Chalice of Healing. This will perfectly spend your 1500 starting gold. As for your starter relic, you should almost always be getting teleport. On niche picks, other relics can work, but really you need teleport to be able to recall to base for free and not miss any farm. It's great if you get poked out and lose a lot of HP early on and have to back. TP is pretty much essential on all solo laners. Alright, so for Guardian starting builds, you can do the sustain potion build on Guardians too, simply by the exact same start as with Warriors. Blessing, Chalice of Healing, and 4 potions. The boot start is also possible on Guardians. Once again, it's the same as Warriors, Blessing, tier 1 boots, and Chalice of Healing. And finally, there's the Imperial Helmet start. This is great if you want to rush into Jade Emperor's Crown or Tyrannical Plate Helm early on. This start is a little riskier because you have less sustain, but it has a large payoff once you finish these early items. For this start, you get Warrior's Blessing, Imperial Helmet, and 4 health potions. It goes without saying that this start is only used against physical lane opponents. Use a different start against magicals. Boots should be your first real item in solo lane in most cases, with the exception of the 9 shield warriors that I listed early on. Those picks will rush into their shield straight away, but grab boots first on other gods. For warriors, you usually want Warrior Tabi, with the exception of Berserker's Shield warriors who use Ninja Tabi for the attack speed since it synergizes really well with the shield. For Guardians, you really have 2 options, those being Shoes of Focus and Shoes of the Magi. Which boots you pick is really dependent on your playstyle and your god pick. Shoes of the Magi offer a little bit more early game damage and a bit of sustain through the lifesteal, and Shoes of Focus offer a ton more mana and CDR if you're quite an ability reliant god that likes to spam a lot. Just take your pick from these 2, I think they're pretty even in terms of power level, and it really just depends on what you like and your playstyle on your current god. Okay, with starting builds and boots covered, let's move on and cover the general item pool and a few build examples for warriors and guardians. For this section, I'm going to split it into 2 parts. The early laning phase and what you should be buying in your first few slots in different situations, and then a bulk section covering what the rest of your build should look like for your 4th, 5th, and 6th slots. So for warriors, there's 4 scenarios that you could be in during the laning phase of solo. Identify which of these scenarios you're in and build accordingly. Building for the situation is critical in solo if you want to be successful. Much more so than other roles where you can often build the same build every game and get away with it, in solo you simply can't do that, so don't try to. Number 1, and by far the most common scenario, is warrior versus warrior in solo with an assassin or warrior in jungle. I can't stress how common this matchup is, so it should be the one you focus on the most. In this case, you want to go straight into physical defense after your boots and your shield if applicable. The reason for this is pretty obvious. The enemy solo is physical, and the enemy jungler is also physical. So bar some freak early rotations from the enemy mid laner, you're only dealing with physical damage sources early on in this scenario, so any physical defense you buy is hugely valuable. Towers and minions also do physical damage, so it only helps more to have early physical defense. Breastplate of Valor is great on any warrior that uses CDR effectively, which is most of them, especially the ability-based warriors. Mystical Mail is good on warriors that either don't use Breastplate too well, like Bellona or maybe Cuchulainn, or if you just want a more aggressive option in general that gives you a little more damage. And the niche but useful option against healers or strong self-sustain would be Contagion. I would only build this against gods that heavily rely on healing and are physical, of course. Usually this item isn't what you want, but I thought I'd include it here just as a situational pick. After your first defense item, I recommend going into either hybrid defense, aka Hide of the Urchin or Spirit Robe, or dedicated magical defense, depending on how much impact the enemy mid laner is having on you. If the mid is causing you trouble, go into dedicated magical defense, such as Pestilence if the enemy has significant healing, or Genji's Guard or Runic Shield shield if they don't. If the mid laner is playing normally and isn't giving you too much trouble though, I highly recommend just going into Hide of the Urchin or Spirit Robe to stack even more physical defense, since you'll still be dealing with mostly physicals at this point in the game, but then you do have that bit of magical defense in case the mid laner does come into fights. So in the double physical scenario, you have a shield if applicable, boots, physical defense, then hybrid defense or magical defense based on the situation. After this, you need to start building to counter the enemy team and use your own judgment for how much of each defense type you need and if you can afford to go damage. Usually I only go for damage items if I'm having no trouble tanking and staying alive in fights. If you're dying often or finding yourself getting shredded or poked out, definitely buy into more defense, it will help a ton. I'll cover item options for these later game situational items later on in the video after I've covered the other 3 laning scenarios. So that's scenario number 1, physical solo and physical jungle. Scenario number 2, physical solo but magical jungle, is mostly the same. Building defense against the solo laner takes priority over defense against the jungler, so I would still recommend going straight into physical defense after your boots and shield here, with the same options as before, breastplate, mystical mail or contagion. After your first item defense is where this scenario differs though. With a magical jungler and a magical mid laner, you want to invest straight into dedicated magical defense in your 3rd slot rather than going into hybrid defense like you would against double physical. The options here are the same as before. Pestilence against healers, Genji's Guard or Runic Shield otherwise. Then you go into counter building and situational picks, which we'll talk about in a bit. Scenario number 3, magical solo laner and physical jungler. This matchup is fairly common as well, probably the 2nd most common matchup after double physical. This would be your typical Guardian solo and Assassin jungle style scenario. For this one, building defense against the solo laner takes precedence as always, so grab early magical defense straight after your boots and shield. Pestilence versus a healing mage or guardian, Genji's or Runic otherwise, you get the idea at this point. Then you have a choice of going into hybrid defense, Urchin or Spirit Robe, or going into dedicated physical defense. In this situation, I'd only really recommend going dedicated physical if the jungler is camping you or is causing problems in the current match. If the enemy jungler is having a normal game and isn't ganking you too often, just get Urchin or some other hybrid defense or health item. Then of course situational items will round out your build. And the final matchup, scenario number 4, is the reverse of double physical, that being magical jungler and magical solo. This very rarely happens, and if it does, you're a lucky player. In this case, just stack magical defense for the entire early game. Since solo and jungle are both magical, and likely the mid laner might be as well, in which case you just become immortal. If this is the case, I recommend buying your standard magical defense item straight after boots, but then buying a second dedicated magical defense item straight afterwards. In the case that the mid laner is physical, you might still want to go hybrid defense here just to make sure they don't shut you down too hard. Keep that in mind, since often if a team is running a magical jungler and magical solo laner, they'll probably replace their mid lane mage with a hunter instead. So that's all the matchup scenarios you'll face in the early game of solo. Just recognize which matchup scenario you're in and tailor your early game defense options to fit the situation. After the early game on your first few items though, you'll need to start building situationally based on how the game is going. What gods the enemy team has, which players are carrying for the enemy team, and which ones aren't doing so well, etc. These are decisions you have to make on your own as they are different for every game, but here's my item pool that I usually choose from when grabbing these items. For warriors, aside from the options I've already mentioned which can still be built later in your build if you need to, Mantle of Discord is amazing later on in the game, maybe in your 5th or 6th slot or after you sell boots. Only Hunter's Garb is likewise better late game since larger scale team fights make better use of its passive. This item is great for additional magical defense beyond the items I've already mentioned, since you're often fighting multiple people as a solo laner in teamfights. Pridwin is very nice, especially on gods that use their ultimates frequently and as an engage tool. Having that extra health shield can be life-saving when you're trying to survive in the enemy's backline after you just ulted in. Caduceus shield is amazing on certain gods. It's not a pick you want on all gods, but any that have really good built-in ability healing such as Camazotz, Achilles, Tyr and the like can make great use of this item. Likewise, Shield of Regrowth is pretty good on healing gods as well. Not as good as Cad Shield, but on certain gods, Regrowth can really help with their movement and getting into and out of the backline. It's definitely a more niche pick though. Gauntlet of Thebes is a deceptively good late game item on solo laners as well. Obviously don't build this early game because you're going to be clearing your own waves and you can't stack it very easily, but in a 4th, 5th or 6th slot item this can be really great as it's very easy to stack once you start rotating and team fighting, since it stacks off kills and you can also leech waves and jungle camps as you rotate. And once it's stacked up, it's the single most gold efficient defense item in the entire game game, giving 60 of each protections and 300 health. Void Shield is nice if you want some physical defense that also comes with a bit of damage. Having the power and percent protection reduction increases your damage a fair bit, especially against tanks, and also allows your other physicals to do a bit more damage too. Blackthorn Hammer has taken some nerfs, but if you want to use it as a hybrid defense item that comes with a bit of damage early on, then it's decent. I would only really get this early on though. It's not typically a great to pick later in the build. There are more valuable options for your final few slots. Frostbound Hammer is also pretty decent on gods that can get into the backline and keep applying that slow. It's also especially good against immobile enemies with no slow immunity. If the mid laner picks Vulcan or Anubis or something, Frostbound can do a lot of work. Now, I don't like to typically go pure damage on my solo laners too much. I'm of the belief that CDR and tankiness equals damage for solo laners because you can stay alive longer and spam your cooldowns, but if you do want to go into damage items, there are two that I like. The first is Heartseeker, and it's usually my go-to on ability-based warriors like Achilles. It's expensive, and I'd only really recommend it as a 6th item or selling your boots for it when you get the Elixir of Speed, but it really amps up your damage pretty heavily, especially when combined with Void Shield. The other damage item I tend to pick up a lot less than Heartseeker, but Masamune is still relevant if you want some damage. It has a little bit of health and protections as well, so it's a solid 5th or 6th slot item in my opinion if you want some more damage. As for your relics on warriors, of course you have Teleport as your first relic most of the time. For your second relic at level 12, I like to use Blink on gods that use it well, plus Shell, Sprint, Thorns, or Horrific Emblem. Take your pick on which of these relics fits your playstyle or the current match the best for your second slot and go for that. So that's all my item options for warriors. Let's cover a few example builds before we move into Guardian build options. For Achilles, Amaterasu, Bellona, Chak, Kukulkan, Erlangchen, Guan Yu, Hercules, Horus, King Arthur, Mulan, Nike, Odin, Osiris, Sun Wukong, Tyr, and finally Vamana. Keep in mind these builds are generic and built to work against physical solo laners. You should be swapping things in and out as you need based on the current match and as you grow your knowledge of the god. Okay, so moving on to Guardian build options. I'll cover these ones a little faster since a lot of the groundwork has been laid out in the warrior section, and Guardians are also much less common than warriors in solo lane. For first item defense, against physicals, I recommend either Jade Emperor's Crown or Breastplate of Valor, but you can also try a Tyrannical Plate Helm rush on heavy push oriented gods, and wave clear focused Guardians. And against magicals, I recommend Pestilence against heavy sustain gods or healers, or Voidstone or Genji's Guard if they have no healing. Moving into the rest of your build, Spirit Robe, Hide of the Urchin and Mantle of Discord are just as relevant on Guardians as they were on warriors, definitely worth a pickup. Stone of Binding is a nice early game bridge item that can give you a bit of extra damage while also granting protections. Ethereal Staff is my go-to damage option on solo lane Guardians. It gives some health and CCR, which is always nice, but also a fair bit of damage both from the power and the passive stealing health from enemies. Soul Reaver is similar to E-Staff, except it's a little more focused on damage than it is on tankiness, and hence I prefer E-Staff right now. However, Soul Reaver as a late game 5th or 6th slot item if you're ahead or selling your boots for it can be good. And all the other defense items for warriors that are neutral apply here too, such as Oni Hunter's Garb, Gauntlet of Thebes, Shield of Regrowth and Pridwin. As for your relics on Guardians, they're pretty much the same as warriors. Teleport will be your first relic, with Shell, Sprint, Blink, Thorns and Horrific Emblem being great options for your second relic choice. Just take your pick. Alright, so with item options covered, here's some example builds for all the currently viable Guardians in solo lane. Here's Artio, Athena, Kabrakan, Geb, Jormungandr, Kuzumbo, Sobek, Terra, Jingchen, Yamoja, and Ymir. In this section, I'll explain everything you need to know about what happens and why in the laning phase of solo, and how to get that juicy XP and gold lead so you can make an impact on teamfights. Since this section has a lot of information about varying aspects of the solo lane laning phase, I'm going to subdivide it into a few sections to make it easier to digest. So starting at, well, the start, we have the level 1 fight in solo. This short period, both before minions clash and during the clearing of the first wave, can have rippling impacts on the rest of your match, and it's important to know what you and your opponent are capable of and what's best to prioritize on that first wave. So the first minion wave will meet in lane at 30 seconds in. Anytime before that I'll call the pre-game, in which you can establish lane pressure even before minions meet or stack your Warrior's Blessing. If you're a ranged god, make sure you're using those ranged auto attacks to poke your opponent and force them back to tower. This way you can get access to their minion wave earlier than normal and effectively clear the first wave faster. You might also get into small boxing matches with your lane opponent if you're both willing to fight. Whether or not you should do this is based on your current character and how they can box. Some will excel at level 1 boxing, such as Hercules or Bellona, and others won't so much. When the first wave meets, your sole priority should be clearing it as fast as possible so you can get back to your blue buff to split the XP and hit level 2. If you get your full first wave but don't get to blue buff in time, you'll remain level 1 for the second minion wave. And likewise, if you miss some of your wave to get the blue buff XP, you'll also be level 1. If your opponent is level 2 at this point, you're going to lose lane pressure as well as probably the first totem of coup for your team, so it's essential to get back to blue buff ASAP while not missing minions to split that XP and gold with your jungler and hit level 2. Okay, so moving on to minion mastery. Understanding minions and what they're capable of is absolutely essential to being a great solo laner. The minions are your primary source of XP and gold, so my best advice would be never miss a minion wave unless you have a very good reason for doing so. If you're 10% health and risk dying, then yeah, maybe recall and miss that minion wave, or if you're rotating to help your team secure a gold fury, that's worth it for missing one wave. But in general, don't go wandering off into the jungle or going to do like your own back camps or something, or going to fight people at the cost of your minion wave. It's how amateur solo laners fall behind in farm and ultimately lose lane, even if they have great mechanical skill on their god. A good farming strategy and paying attention to your wave at all times can make up for a substantial mechanical skill gap. That's one of the things I like most about solo lane. Your macro game can get you very far in the role. Minions hurt, especially early game before you have your defense items online, and paying attention to your minion aggro is a key way to win trades consistently in lane and even land early kills. Minions will aggro to you if you damage the enemy god, and likewise for if they damage you. You have to watch out for this since you'll take extra poke that wasn't necessary, however sometimes it can be beneficial to aggro the enemy wave. If the enemy minions are hitting you, they're not hitting your own minions, so you can effectively slow down the enemy solo laner's clear speed by deliberately aggroing their wave, taking damage yourself, and in the process giving you a lane pressure advantage. Likewise, if the enemy solo laner pulls your minion wave, you can potentially look to punish them as your minions aggro to them, and they can take a lot of poke for that. So just watch out for where minion aggro is going and adapt your playstyle based on that. Another quick thing to mention is that the archer minions do over 2/3 of the wave's total damage output. The melee minions at the front do much less damage and are much more avoidable by simply running away, so if you take out the enemy archer minions, it will not only help slow down their clear speed on your own wave, but you can actually fight them with less risk of taking major damage from their wave if you cripple the wave by killing the archers early on. Minions are your lifeblood in solo lane. You can get additional farm from your blue buff, the totem of coup, perhaps yours or the enemy's back camps, but minions are going to be there 100% of the time every 60 seconds like clockwork. Don't shun this amazing source of farm you've been given. So I've mentioned it a bit before, but trading and boxing your opponent is a key part of the solo lane laning phase and will often decide the victor. The reason you want all that farm I just talked about is so that you can win these trades with the enemy solo laner, get pressure, and use that lead to rotate or land kills to snowball yourself and your team even further. When you want to box and how much is really matchup dependent and a decision you have to make game to game. If you typically play gods that are great at boxing and taking early fights, then you can play more aggressive and look to force the enemy solo laner into bad fights for them that allows you to poke them out or even kill them. But if you're on the weaker god for boxing or you just want to stay safe, prioritize farming as I mentioned in the previous section and avoid boxing as much. It's really dependent on your overall playstyle, the god you're playing, the enemy solo's god, and the overall aims of both team comps as a whole. It's worth noting though that when you box the enemy, getting a kill isn't always the end goal. In solo more than any other role, getting a farm lead is all that matters. If you're the type of player that gets a lead through kills and you can get them consistently, then that's great. But keep in mind that if you poke out the enemy solo laner out of lane and they have to either back or play safe under tower and lose gold, that's nearly as effective as landing a kill and can often open up the path for rotations, invades and tower pushes in the same way that a kill would. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the basics of farming, why it's important and why you should prioritize your minion wave, but let's talk a bit more in depth about some advanced farming techniques that can get you that extra lead in solo and really allow you to push your game to the next level. So the flagship strategy that myself and others employ is proxy farming. In simple terms, proxying is killing the enemy minion waves behind their standing towers. This strategy is high risk as you put yourself on the enemy's side of the map between two towers with few ways out, but with high risk comes high reward. The reward of proxy farming is time, simple as that. If you kill the enemy wave behind their tier 1 tower, you save about 10 seconds or so, which can be put to use to get either ahead on a rotation to mid lane, invade enemy camps such as blue buff or back harpies, take the totem of Q for free with no contention, or simply recall and allow yourself 10 seconds of additional time to walk back to lane, causing you to miss less farm. What you do with the time saved by proxying is up to you and will change based on the situation, but that's why proxying can be very useful. It generates time and lane pressure for you to do other things. Proxying isn't always sunshine and rainbows, however. As I said, it's a very risky strategy and should only be done when you know it's safe. Wards help with this so you can see enemy rotations, as well as having a lead or quick mobility options to escape a gank if it comes your way. Proxying the lane is basically like holding up a giant neon sign to the enemy team saying, "I'm out of position, come gank me." So be prepared to face resistance if you proxy, and only do so if you evaluate it to be safe. Knowing if it's safe comes with experience, but you can use these pointers that I mentioned to make those kind of decisions. Another technique I use is lane freezing. This is essentially stalling the wave and not clearing it so that the wave stays where you want it to be in the lane instead of pushing towards the enemy. This is useful in a couple of situations. The primary one is when you want to aggressively zone the enemy solo away from the wave, thus making them miss farm. This is best done when you have a lead and know you can take a fight. So the enemy's two choices become stand there or back, missing that farm that you're keeping them away from, or come and fight you, resulting in probably a losing trade for the enemy because you're ahead. It's win-win for you. But of course, this is only useful when you know you can win that fight. If you freeze out the enemy and they can simply walk up to you and win the fight, it's pointless. So only use this when you know you can take that fight and win most of the time. Also, as with proxying, using lane freezing in this way can often entice a gank from the enemy jungler, so stay sharp and ward up if you're going to employ this strategy frequently. It's also worth mentioning that you can also freeze the lane defensively. This is mostly done if you don't want the lane to push and you want your farm to stay within a safe distance of your own tower. This is usually done if you're behind. This way you can stay close to your tower and close to safety and hold the wave there, which is much lower risk for you than pushing up the wave to the enemy's tower, in which case you have to push very far up to get that same farm. Also, if the enemy laner leaves the lane for whatever reason, to get their blue buff maybe, you can do a quick freeze while they're gone so a couple of minions die and they don't get XP and gold, whereas if you push the wave, your minions would still be alive and they'd be getting that farm. Alright, so with some of the more advanced techniques covered, let's move on to an area that a lot of people seem to struggle with, that being rotations, when to rotate, how to rotate effectively, and what to do if the enemy rotates as a solo laner. So when to rotate? This question is somewhat subjective as it depends on your playstyle, god pick, and the current state of the match. Sometimes it's better to rotate, and sometimes it's better to stay in lane and farm. In basic terms, you want to rotate when the gains of a rotation outweigh the lost farm from making that rotation. So there's two ways to make sure your rotations are effective. You can either minimize the farm that you lose from the rotation, or you can maximize the gains of that rotation. To minimize farm loss, you can proxy like I mentioned earlier, which gives you a longer amount of time before the next minion wave meets in lane, giving you extra time to commit to a rotation before you need to be back for the next minion wave. You can also rotate and use your teleport to get back to lane quickly, or rotate using upgraded teleport to a ward and then run back to lane. You can minimize farm loss by rotating when the enemy solo lane backs or rotates themselves. This way you still lose farm, but the enemy solo loses an equal amount of farm and the rotation doesn't put you behind. So you can employ a few of these tactics to make sure your rotations are cost effective and you don't lose too much for them. And then the other method of making sure your rotations are effective is maximizing the gains of that rotation. This comes with experience mostly. You need to be able to read the situation and check the map for rotation opportunities where you can potentially get a kill or secure an objective or tip the scales of a team fight in your team's favour. It's definitely worth losing a wave or even two if you rotate, kill the enemy mid laner and then get Gold Fury off of that. But it becomes not worth it if all you do is rotate, poke the enemy mid laner back to tower and then walk back to lane. It's really a cost benefit analysis on what you get from rotating at the time versus what you lose in terms of farm or lane pressure. Also, one thing to note is that you don't always have to commit to a rotation. You can move into the jungle intending to rotate to mid, but then realise their mid is on the tower and you're probably not going to get anything from it, in which case you can maybe invade the enemy camps or just proxy instead of rotating. Or even just walk back to the lane before the next minion wave meets, in which case you've lost nothing. Okay, moving on, let's talk a bit about ganks and warding. So solo plays quite differently in terms of ganks than any other role, and that's mostly down to the typical gods you'll see in solo and jungle. As I mentioned before in the build section, a vast majority of solo lane matchups are warrior versus warrior with assassins in jungle. That's just how Smite works. This leads to physical defense being extremely broken at countering both your laner and the jungler, so ganks are often much riskier for the jungler to make once you get your first item defense online as a solo laner. But that doesn't mean you can get complacent and expect no ganks. If the jungler has a reason to gank you, you, then you're going to get ganked, so don't go proxy farming on 10% health and expect to not draw attention your way. With that said, you can often play more aggressive in solo and expect less ganks than other roles, and even if they do come, you can often escape fairly easily if you're a warrior due to tankiness and sustain. I often see situations in solo where a 1v2 gank is turned around into a kill or even a double kill, so don't be afraid to fight on ganks if you have a lead in lane or if you're nearly full HP. But the same rules as other roles apply. Don't play over aggressive on low HP and watch the enemy solo's mannerisms. If they're fighting you in a boxing match they clearly aren't winning but they continue to push you, there might be a gank coming. And of course, wards are still very important in solo, especially if you want to play aggressive. Here's some general ward spots I like for solo, as well as a couple that I tend to go for if I'm looking more to proxy or do frequent invids of blue buff or back camps. These generic wards will catch most rotations from mid and a lot of the enemy junglers pathing as well, and the aggressive wards are great for tracking the enemy jungle as they do their speed to blue rotation, so you can make sure they're not currently doing that path, as they'll likely take a quick detour to shut down your proxy if they are currently doing that. Alright, so let's cover everything you need to know about the Totem of Coup in solo. This will be a fairly short section, but it's important to know how, when, and why to take the Totem of Coup, as it's a great way to get your team ahead and have an actual impact on the early game from your lane. So Totem is a passive objective that spawns in solo lane at 30 seconds in and will despawn once killed after 15 minutes. So you have the first 15 minutes of the game to take this thing as many times as possible. It will scale up in HP every time you take it, so later in the game it can become pretty hard to take. The way you take this objective is by filling up a meter in blue by damaging it. Once your meter reaches full, you secure the totem. However, the enemy solo also has a meter in red that runs alongside yours, and it's basically a race to whoever can fill their meter first. There's no sniping or stealing this objective. All damage put in by both teams is completely separate, so just put more damage into the totem faster than the enemy can and you'll claim it for your team. Early on, you want to be taking the totem as much as possible. It gives 20 gold to the entire team, so 100 gold total, and a buff to your tower areas that gives 5% movement speed and 20 to 30 MP5 based on game time when you step into your tower area, which also lasts for 10 seconds once you step out of tower. This is great for keeping teammates topped up on mana in the early game, as well as the extra gold. It really adds up. If you take the totem say 10 times in the early game, that's a total of 1000 gold for your team plus countless amounts of mana. It can have a real impact on the game that unfortunately you yourself can't have from solo because you'll spend most of your time in lane farming. I tend to take totem between minion waves, as I mentioned earlier in this section. Minions are your top priority and you shouldn't miss a wave without good reason. Totem is not a good enough reason. Prioritize your wave, and once you have that farm secured, go for the totem. Alright, so the final section of the laning phase part of this video is recalling. This is a pretty simple one, but recalling at the right times and recognizing when your enemy recalls is important in solo. So in an ideal world, you want to back when you don't miss any farm. So either straight after you shove your wave or when you have teleport up to get straight back to lane. But this isn't always the case, and sometimes you will have to back and miss farm, be that because you got poked out or can't stay in lane, or you need to finish an item or whatever. Just try and minimize any farm loss as much as you can when you recall. So recall either between waves, when the enemy solo also recalls so that the wave will stall instead of pushing into your tower, or of course when you have TP ready. You also want to back when you can buy a decent amount of items. If you finish your boots or your shield, then it's a great time to recall, but if you're 200 gold off of finishing an important item, try as hard as you can to stay in lane and get that remaining gold, otherwise you'll have to come back to lane and then recall again, missing even more farm. And that's how you get behind in solo, so try to time your backs appropriately. So for this section, I'm going to assume you're a tanky frontliner. If you're playing full damage Anubis solo, this info will change and you should probably play more like a standard squishy mage, but most of the time you'll be on a warrior / guardian / tanky assassin that can frontline effectively. So I'm going to assume that's what you're playing for this section. So a solo laner's job in teamfights is, for the most part, the job of a backline diver and zoner. Your main goal is to keep the enemy carries from hitting your own team, be that through CCing them, killing them, or forcing them to deal with you instead of your other teammates. The way you achieve this goal doesn't matter, just make sure you're aiming to do this in teamfights. If the enemy mid and ADC are out of the fight, that leaves your own teammates to just run through the enemy frontline as they have no damage to back up their tankiness and CC. Some solo laners, especially more defensive warriors and guardians, can play a peel oriented playstyle that revolves more around backlining your own team and keeping your carries alive. But in general, that role is filled more by the support, and your job as a solo laner is to dive the enemy backline and create space for your team to do their thing. Keep in mind that you often don't have to be killing people or doing massive damage to be an effective frontliner. That's what you have carries for. Your main job is just to be annoying and keep the enemy tension on you, while of course not dying in the process. That's why you build extremely tanky and don't buy into too much damage as a solo laner. In terms of objective play, your role in these fights derives from your general playstyle in teamfights. You can either be tanking the objective for your team if that's needed, or you can be a zoner that keeps enemies out and stops them from stealing the objective from your team. When it comes to objectives, you can really fill in what's needed as a warrior. If your support isn't there or is too low to tank the objective, you can tank. If your jungler isn't there or is too low to zone and kill enemies, you can do that. Just analyze the situation and fill the role that's needed of you when it comes to objectives. And in terms of sieging, you often want to be the first one in to both tank the structure and zone enemies away so your hunter and other teammates can just take down the towers. And likewise, your job is reversed on defense and your main goal is to keep the enemy hunter and others out of range of your structures so that they don't get taken. But anyway, that's about it from me on the comprehensive solo lane guide for Season 7. This one was especially long as I wanted to go into as much detail as I could about these topics, especially the laning phase, since that's what a lot of people struggle with coming into solo lane. If you watched until the end, then you're a real trooper and I thank you for that. Maybe consider subscribing for more guides in the future like this one on the channel, and dropping a like before you leave if you enjoyed. But yeah, I'm done here. Catch you guys in another video later on. Have a great day, stay safe, and peace out you nerds.